Welcome to the Universal Lens channel. I'm Chris Kovel. For today's episode, we have on Kathryn Brookshier. Kathryn is a mixed methods UX research manager at Indeed. I thought today's conversation went very well. We got into a number of different topics. Mainly, I reached out and wanted to talk to her about some of her articles that she wrote, specifically around job posting for UX and how it's changed over time and how it compares with other tech jobs, which I found quite fascinating and kind of against the grain of some of the messaging that you would hear on social media and other places in terms of the health, let's say, of UX and the tech industry in general. But we had other things to discuss as well. So we got into a pretty long discussion around centralized versus decentralized teams, how she would call embedded model for UX research. I definitely pushed her on some of the issues that might arise when you have these cross-functional teams in terms of trying to get the work done. And I think she handled my questions with a lot of grace and professionalism. We also had discussions around UX maturity levels, but mainly focused on trying to interpret her data and wanted to get her take on what she thought it meant and why she decided to publish this kind of work. So really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. So Kathryn Brookshier, welcome to the Universal Lens.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah, so at this point, I would have already introduced you and given the audience a little bit of a bio, but I'd like to kind of start at the beginning. When would you say that you first kind of noticed or you got aware of this profession known as UX research?
So during my undergrad, which I did at Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering, we had a number of required courses that helped us focus on the user. And so in my sophomore year, I was in a class called User-Oriented Collaborative Design. And that was really the first time that I had encountered research with users. And we had a number of other classes after that. But that was really what piqued my interest about the field of UX in general.
So what was it in particular about research that you found interesting and fascinating kind of upfront when you were first exposed to it?
I had done a lot of coursework in engineering and did a lot in my undergrad. I think what really interested me was the idea of putting it together for people. I think like a lot of people who are interested in the field of UX, because it made me challenge my assumptions. And it also helped me understand how we could make better decisions when designing for people. Sometimes we go off in the wrong direction if we don't thoroughly know our audience. And this seemed like a really excellent way to get closer to building for the people that we intended to build for.
Now, after that first encounter, when you were in undergrad, did you know about a field called user experience or user experience research more specifically? Or did it take some more time, some more years before you saw a more, I guess you can say, palpable career path that you've now pursued?
At first, what I was most familiar with was the design aspect, since that was more common earlier on, especially, more than a decade ago, 10 to 15 years ago. And only a few years after that did I more formally encounter UX research, but I was fortunate during my undergrad to also have a UX research internship. So I was able to understand that the field existed early on. However, I also noticed at that time that there were a lot fewer open UX research roles. So it was definitely a conflict I had because I enjoyed research the most, but I knew that there was more roles at the time in UX design.
So, in particular, you've written a few very interesting articles that piqued my interest and was why I first kind of got, was aware of you and started reading some of the other things that you've written. And in particular, I think you've been publishing articles on job posting data regarding UX, and then also really within tech, a wider tech industry. But before we get on and kind of dive into some of those articles that you've published, which I'll also make sure to link in the description, so that all the audience members can kind of take a look at them and know that what we're talking about. I want to get your sense about UX and the current state of the field, and maybe come at it from a little bit more of a theoretical angle to begin with, and then we'll kind of get more into the weeds with your writings. So, how do you conceptualize UX, and do you see a division between, say, UX and human-centered design, and then also product development? Do you really see major differences between those three, let's say, concepts?
Let's start with the conceptualization of UX. So with that, I think UX is really about understanding user needs, wants, and problems, especially so that we can then go and address these needs, wants, and problems. And there's different ways we can do that. The understanding, I would say, probably falls more under the research umbrella. And then trying to solve for that, I see as falling more under that design, that content umbrella, to make sure that we're able to produce something that meets those needs. I'm not sure between the human-centered design, the product design, and the other one, I forgot which one. I'm not really sure I know how to answer the difference between the three, because it is an evolving field. But I think the point that all of them are trying to address is really that we are able to create solutions that are delivering on the value propositions, and solutions that people can actually complete, go through easily, and feel confident in when they finish their tasks.
Yeah. So would you say that the solutions, because that's a pretty kind of vague and broad term, right? It can mean a lot of things. Is it typically a product? And how do you think about products in terms of let's link up product and user research, right? So user research, you were talking before about how, the understanding of the user needs and the current state, let's say, really is where research kind of focuses on and leans into. Would you say the outcomes that, or the impact that user research, especially up front when you're trying to understand and not really quote unquote test, more evaluative downstream, would you say that the research that's happening upstream, the outcome or the orientation or what's being done with it is typically going towards the requirements of creating a product or service?
In an optimal world, yes, absolutely, because we want to make sure that we even have a sense of the space, because like I said earlier, often we can assume what people will need and it may be way off base. So the more that we can get into the understanding of the day-to-day lives that people have and where our intended solution space fits, broadly speaking, That's how we can focus in on what we do need to develop and can go in again to those product requirements and such. I also think it's the space that has the highest potential impact in more of that generative research. If we think about a butterfly's wings, putting in a little bit of upfront effort to fully understand that, that can help the team really scout ahead and understand what they're trying to build for, as opposed to going back after the fact with maybe a product launch that is not as successful as we want it to be to try and diagnose what went wrong.
Yeah. No, the reason why I bring it up is just because I feel like, researchers, especially younger ones or people who want to get into UX research or design research, I think it's important for them to know that, especially if you want to make that, deliver impact upfront and do through generative research. And this brings up another question that I have for you around why maybe generative research gets skipped typically. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But before we get there, I think it's essential for, people who want to lean into this research space to have product sense and to understand the product development lifecycle, because ultimately there's, doing the research and there's making sure that it's quality and making sure you're picking the right methods and making sure that it's being executed properly and with the right amount of rigor and this kind of thing. But then also how it's oriented so that you can actually make a splash and make an impact. I think you need to sometimes wear a different hat, a non-research hat, maybe a more either business or product hat, so that you can, so that those insights can be and facts can be properly integrated into the system.
Absolutely. And you're describing something that I would also consider a split from someone who's a little bit more entry level or junior, that execution of the research in a rigorous way, selecting those right methods, being able to demonstrate how your evidence leads to insights and recommendations. Often that starts with a more evaluative type of research, such as usability studies and the like. And then as someone gains more experience focusing on some of those bigger problems, like what problems should we be tackling in the first place? What kind of research do we need to be doing to get there? But yeah, it requires a little bit more of a business sense, understanding, where the company is trying to go, where the team is trying to go, and figuring out where we have gaps in our knowledge and how we can go about filling those gaps.
So it's interesting. And I think I might agree with you on this, but you kind of sketched and outlined this trajectory, it seems, from a UX researcher like maturing through their career, whereas they start with more evaluative type research and then move up to more generative. So would you look at generative research as being a more advanced method or a more advanced style of work?
Yes and no. So I think all research methods, they need to be treated as equal, but I think it's the approach and making sure we're asking the right questions that I think is really critical here. So I tend to think of generative research as something that might be something that someone more senior would do. However, if you're coming into a new team or a new company, you still need to get a foundational understanding of the space. And so that may include, reading previous research, doing some other methods that are just helping you get to know the people before we dive in and pinpoint the type of questions that we need to ask. Because a lot of it is just getting into the space in the first place before we're able to really produce those quality results, because we know the population.
Yeah, no, great. So going back to one of the kind of a question that I teased earlier around generative research and why it typically is skipped more often, at least in my experience, and from what I've read and from people other researchers I've spoken with, how that typically gets not focused on compared to evaluative?
It can be. I don't think that's a great situation to be in for sure. So I think that really depends a little bit on how well research has established itself on that team in the company. Because sometimes people don't even know to do it in the first place. So part of that is simply education and knowing that it's possible. Another part is making room on the roadmap for it and having a curious team and having a curious set of questions. But I like to think of people having a portfolio of different things that they're working on. Again, some of that more evaluative, some of it more generative, but making sure that we're addressing both what's going to go out the door soon and what we're planning for in 6 months to a year. So I think it speaks a little bit more to the maturity of the team.
Yeah. Are there any tips or things that you've learned, maybe the hard way, in terms of trying to push for maturity and watching UX maturity grow within organizations, and ways to maybe expedite that process, and any learnings there?
One of the classic and easy ways is if we know we want to do something evaluative, often we can do something like bring an interview to the beginning of, say, a usability study. So we can put in a couple questions to have that generative research and produce something in addition to what is being asked for in the first place. So that's one really great reason, or one really great way to give a team a taste of what generative can do. And when they start seeing it, sometimes they'll ask for more. So that's one pretty standard way that I've seen people get generative in the door. Otherwise, I think it's about if you have a good relationship with your manager, working with them to create the space. That's something that I like to do with all of my team members, is to make sure there is space for every quarter and half for them to be doing a variety of different work and supporting them and basically making room and pushing back that we need some of this. So that's another avenue that people can pursue. And then finally, it's, trusting yourself. When I was an IC, which stands for individual contributor, one of the things I knew is I had a pretty good sense of what people would want to know in a few months, but just didn't know to ask for yet. And so part of that is just going ahead and doing the research and having people love it and distribute it and having it define those roadmaps. But that takes a good business sense and understanding of, say, a company's OKRs, and ultimately what is driving your multidisciplinary partners so that you know what's going to help them succeed. And if you're giving them results that are going to help them peg some wins on the board for themselves, then that's something that I found to be a very effective strategy. But it takes a knowing of who you're working with to make that happen.
Yeah. And it makes me think of also different, I guess you can say, approaches and different ways of thinking about the strategy behind how to be more deliberate with the type of research that you're doing. So it does seem like for the generative type of research, the researcher themselves can kind of take the initiative, and the researcher or the research team may have hunches or may find, this idea or this theme is something that's interesting that we want to pursue. And we may not need to get, quote unquote, buy-in from a product manager because there's not really yet a product there. It's just a space that's a little bit uncertain, or, there might, be something that we may not know that we want to uncover that then can lead to something interesting down the road. Whereas when you're on a team, and I don't wouldn't even call evaluative. I don't like saying that evaluative research is like non-strategic, because I think it can set direction and help, design teams know what to work on. So that is kind of a strategy, a business strategy, so to speak, or at least a team-based strategy. But it seems like it's more focused. And maybe this is partly why, you were making the distinction between when a younger researcher starts, evaluative seems to be a better fit for people who are maybe a little bit less experienced. Whereas when it comes to having more experience and being in an organization for a while, or being a researcher for, and getting your acumen up, then you can lean more into that generative side of things, because there does seem to be a lot more openness with the different directions you can go from a strategy.
Yeah, I very much agree with that.
Cool. Some other things to talk about before we jump into your data and discuss kind of why you collected it, what you were trying to get, what you were trying to say in terms of what it meant, and maybe thinking about what it means for the field moving forward too, because a lot's happened in the last few years, and it's been a very interesting time, and I think your data reflects that. So, but before we do that, I kind of wanted to get your sense too on research in particular. In maybe it doesn't have to be large organizations; it could be medium-sized organizations, but in terms of ways that we integrate with business teams. So the framing that I like to use here, and I've seen used in reports and how on other research podcasts, this kind of thing, is centralized versus decentralized, right? So if you for my research, if you rewind maybe 20 years, a lot of the people that had our jobs were not in corporate organizations. They were kind of in agencies, these design agencies that corporations would hire. And the relationship between design and research and business was much different than having, baked in research, full-time positions in business. So have you seen, would you like to see the field mature into more of a decentralized practice, so that you have research in an organization, but then researchers are kind of added to product teams across many different departments? Or do you also find value of having a centralized system that interacts with the business in a more, I would say, formal way, so almost like an agency? So I'm not sure if that, if you understand my distinction there, but
yeah, a lot of good points to go through. And before I dive into centralized and decentralized, I think it's worth noting the shifts that you were just speaking about. Pre-2000, we're looking at a lot of companies, and Nielsen Norman were very important in saying, hey, your users are people and you need to think about their needs. And then that 2000 to 2010 decade was a lot about the emergence of agencies and how companies can hire agencies to do research and then take that research and move forward with it. From between 2010 and 2020, we start seeing a lot more companies hire researchers in their companies. And so that was a really big shift from this last decade.
Sorry, you said we started seeing that around 2010. Was that the beginning, or is it?
I don't actually know, but I know that for the broad scheme of things, how things have changed, I like to think about it in a decade by decade change. So for me, we saw a lot more in-house researchers this past decade. And then starting in 2020, thinking about, again, another decade shift, I like to think about a lot of different mixed methods and bringing together a lot of our different data sources to paint a more holistic picture. But going to your point on centralized versus decentralized. So a lot of companies, of course, you have to hire the first researcher. So they're going to be a team of one before they grow, if they're able to deliver value and show that expanding the team would be beneficial to the business. So we either have that centralized type, which you're describing, where you might have a team of researchers and then you have requests coming in from all over the business. And then individual researchers will be put on different projects, and there may not be a lot of consistency in terms of the product or the subject from study to study. And that can be different from a more decentralized, or what I call an embedded model, where a researcher is dedicated to a specific team or teams. So I think there's reasons to have both. I tend to prefer an embedded model because the researchers get to know their colleagues better. They get to understand the team, the long-term team goals. They understand their product more deeply. And so it's not just servicing requests, but it's a much more collaborative type of environment, and an environment where you can also propose research and research that's going to help the business, and not just be doing intake for requests. So I think that can really up-level the quality of the research output. But that said, sometimes we have overflow. And so with that overflow, we might need to go to, a centralized team, even within our own business. So sometimes that might be a rapid research team. Sometimes we might hire an external agency for that type of work, or sometimes it just doesn't get conducted because we don't have the bandwidth. So those are some of the different models. I think they're both useful in their own way. I happen to prefer the embedded model because I think it is more effective dollar for dollar in how we help the business.
I know other people have experienced this, where that the teams are not ready, I think, for UX to be added to them, because when you drop a UXer, either designer or a researcher, maybe a content person, onto teams that are a bit immature, it can get into a situation where the UXer is not really being taken seriously, and there's not really a product design roadmap or system in place so that the UX researcher or designer knows how to properly make impact. And if you're a researcher and you're on a team that's very immature and they don't really understand the process of starting with user needs and understanding the current state, how you outlined it in the beginning, and then moving from that understanding and being, empirical and systematic in terms of locating the problems to then fix with design. If they don't have that mindset, it can be a very challenging environment to navigate. So I feel like it's almost like it's more dangerous. I feel like if you're going to go with the embedded model, then maturity must be there.
And maybe we can make sure to split the difference between an individual's maturity and their own career growth within UX from the maturity of the company's UX practice. I think that's pretty important here. When I think about someone joining a team, whether that's just on a one-off project basis or an embedded model, it does change things. But, in UX, there's always going to have to be education as part of that. So if someone is joining a more immature team, I think it's incumbent upon the company or the director or manager to make sure that that team is getting someone who does know how to express the value and bring a certain level of maturity to the team. I would not want to put someone who is less experienced on a team that is not very mature itself in terms of their practice, because that might not set that person up for success. Or if you are doing that, making sure that person has a coach so that they can navigate those conversations and make sure that they are providing value. Because we aren't necessarily trained in our education to do that, to advocate for it. A lot of us get into the field because, we want to make the world a better place, and that doesn't always come with some of the business acumen that people often develop on the job.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're talking, I think, a little bit about politics, which you need, especially when there's low maturity. You have to be able to advocate for the practice, advocate for your work, help people see the bigger picture. And sometimes I've been on teams where it's not easy because, you have to do the work. You have to make sure that you're contributing to the team itself, however they're organized. I mean, this is why, for me, I've become very interested in this idea of cross-functionality, right? We always hear about when we're talking about embedded models, we're definitely talking about cross-functionality, right? And I think each organization is a little bit different. I've been on teams where there's data science that's a function, where business is usually a function, typically research and design. You can maybe even throw in content. There's a lot of different job titles that you sometimes have to be working with, and I think it varies. But to have a way to have all the different functions come together in like a consistent way, so that you're delivering value consistently and frequently, and you have goals and you have direction and this kind of thing. I think when you're in an embedded model, like that becomes pretty serious, and it needs to be taken seriously, because, the alternative, typically you're not chasing, if you're a researcher, you're not chasing the business or the design if you're centralized, right? They're coming to you, they have some purpose that they're there for. Maybe it's not, maybe you need to massage that because they're not actually even sure why they're there, but there's a reason why they're coming to you. But when you're dropping a researcher on a team, there's a lot of times when it's up to the researcher to like make a case and to try to quote unquote sell. And that's a different conversation, right? Because there's not a real need there. So if you have project managers or whoever is kind of leading these embedded teams who don't really are not actively interested in using research the way that maybe some researchers would like to be used, there's a tension that gets created that you have to somehow work through. And I think that tension can be fixed through a more systematic structure of the team and the different functions and roles within the team. Because if that stuff's like not well defined, then you have a lot of people trying to go in different directions, and it becomes hard to collaborate.
Absolutely. But let's talk about this, because this is a really important thing if you're a first researcher on a team. So one of the things is, if the business need should be there. So if someone is a manager, they've hired you onto the team, they should have been seeing regular demand from this team, or pretty significant business opportunity or business risk, where they want to put a researcher and dedicate them to a specific team. So that's one. So there probably should have been a history of need from that specific team. The next thing is that once, if you happen to be that first researcher on a team, a big part about that is going to be developing those relationships, whether those are relationships with the designers, the product managers, the engineers, content folks, if you're fortunate enough to have them, QA, etc. And having those ongoing conversations about first what you're learning. So as people are seeing the value that you are delivering and seeing how it affects things, that's really important. But then also having an ear to the ground of what's happening next, whether that's more concrete. We know that perhaps we're going to be building something this quarter. It's likely going to need some sort of research associated with it. How do we make sure to plan for that so that we can strike while the iron is hot, get folks involved, make sure whatever changes we need are implemented, and then we can move on, show impact. And having those relationships, then you can parlay into more influence and more influence on the roadmap. These are the things that we don't know. And here's how knowing them is going to help us address it. So I would say, first off, that business need is critical. If you're that researcher, understanding from your manager why they saw this need, and understanding from the team as well, like, do they see it or not? And trying to tailor their education and how you interact with the team based on that.
Are there any kind of maybe experiences that you've had where you've been an IC or you've been managing an IC who is struggling to provide value on an embedded model team, and maybe ways to work through those issues?
It's very different when you're the first researcher on the team versus if you've been on a team that's had a researcher before, or there's a decent number of researchers that are dedicated to the team. Usually when there's a larger team, there's been some good established procedures before, and there's sort of a knowledge on the team of where research fits in. But I would say a common refrain, if you're in those early stages, is that research takes too long, and that's often what I hear when people are thinking a little bit more last minute and they haven't necessarily been as planful. So if you're thinking, okay, we want to launch a feature this quarter, then sometimes a less mature team might say something like, well, we've dedicated 8 weeks of engineering effort to this. And again, for this less mature team, oh, whoops, we need designs tomorrow. And oh, we definitely don't have time for research here. But part of that really just comes down to planning, because if we knew this several more months in advance, even, a month more in advance, we can say, well, if we want to launch on this date, then we can work backwards. This is roughly how much engineering time we're going to need, maybe a little extra time for QA as well before we launch to production. Then here's how much time we need for design. And here's how much time we need for research. A big part of the time suck on research's side is simply recruiting participants. And that isn't necessarily as much work as it is time. It takes time, like over a week or 2 or 3, depending how challenging the recruit is, to get it done. So honestly, it can be very little extra for if you're just thinking about getting to the implementation phase with an engineering part. As long as you're just backing up and saying, hey, when do we need to start this? Then it can be so much easier to include it, making sure that you have time to improve the designs and the content before engineering picks something up. So I would say that's one of the first conversations to have, is to help people not just think about today, not just think about what they're working on, but think about what's next.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, yes, when the planning happens, a lot of times I think for let's say lower maturity teams, the research is not even considered when the planning is happening, and researchers aren't even involved in those conversations. And I mean, I've been on teams where, there's no lead time built into let's just say so again, it's teams looking at validation and checking boxes in terms of evaluative studies where they give you a few weeks and they don't have any time to redesign the solution based on the findings and recommendations of the evaluative, let's say, usability study or whatever it is.
Yeah. And one of the things that I ask my team members to do is when they're talking with, say, the designer or the product manager, often for the research, one of the first questions, aside from what do we want to learn and why, is how is this going to be used? And if the response is, well, we don't have any time to make fixes this time, but we'll know for the next time, then we say, hey, then maybe this isn't the best use of our time. They're like, no, but we want to validate it. It's like, no, you don't need a gold star sticker like you're in elementary school that, you checked the UX research box and you validated it. Really what we want here is to make sure that if we're doing the work, that is going to have an impact on the decisions we make on the product. And so part of that is having like a good backlog of ideas and helping the team understand the trade-offs. And so that's one of the best techniques that I always encourage people to use is like, how is this going to be used? And if the answer is it's not, then we can work on other things.
I think what you're getting at is from a strategic ways of approaching your work and ways of working cross-functionally, you as a researcher should have some agency in terms of what it is you're doing. And, it's hard for people to say no sometimes. You talk about the relationship building aspect, right? You want to make sure that your colleagues are respecting what you do, but also making sure that, you're not ruffling too many feathers in terms of, being a team player. But there are times when, it's partly why in my experience, in my career, working agency protects you a lot of times from the certain trials and politics and infighting that you have to deal with sometimes with lower maturity embedded teams. Whereas you can kind of just build out that relationship, build out that, let's say, contract when they come to you. And then if it's not really making a lot of sense, if you can you can kind of feel out that it's kind of low priority or low value, it's very easy to move on to something else. But when you're with those people and you're going to continue that relationship, you want to make sure the relationship is strong and you're actively working on it and actively kind of having this give and take. And what collaboration is, but it can get slightly demoralizing, I think, at times when you have people who are making decisions and who are, let's say, more senior in terms of the cross-functionality aspects in let's say the way that who has to listen to who in terms of an embedded model. When they're not taking the research seriously, it can become a very a difficult place to be in, and you're kind of caught in between a rock and a hard place sometimes, because what the best thing to do from a research point of view and from a user point of view. And it does appear that sometimes corners are being cut for the reasons that you've already listed. So it's going to take too long. They have other incentives that they have to deal with that don't involve caring about the research being, done to a level that you as the researcher want it to be done. You want to get it to. So I don't know. I'm trying to get a sense of different mindsets or strategies or ways of interacting with people to help facilitate that problem that can come up a lot of times, I think, from an embedded point of view.
Yeah. So one is to make sure that your team members understand trade-offs. So if they ignore a recommendation of sorts, what kind of impact is that going to have on a product release? Is this a blocker? Is someone not going to be able to say, complete the checkout flow and pay your company? That's a huge red flag. And understanding sort of the metrics and what's important to the team are going to be really helpful there. Even more helpful if you have access to the data and know those team goals. So I would encourage everyone who works in a research capacity to make sure that they know and understand them. And if they don't, then to go and seek that out from some of their trusted allies. So that's one. The other is knowing that you're not going to win every battle. So you are going to probably come out with a number of recommendations from any given study that you have, understanding which are the most critical and helping the team understand why, and understanding maybe the major things versus the nice to haves. That can be really helpful when people are trying to triage what they are and aren't going to do. So I, as an individual contributor, I know that I'm not going to get every single recommendation in, and that's okay. Part of that is saying, well, here's from the user perspective what is most important. That doesn't necessarily take into account the cost of how much something is going to take in terms of build time. How much spaghetti code do we have to yank out in the back end if we want to make this change versus can we add just like one more day of dev time? So all of these are helping people understand how to make those trade-offs. But more importantly, and sometimes I see this, is that people haven't necessarily produced enough compelling evidence for their stakeholders to believe it in the first place, which is always a sad thing, and I can see you nodding there. But I've always found that video clips, audio clips are very, very good at inciting people to action, more so than almost anything else that I've used. So, using your evidence in a way that pushes your team to doing some of the right things for the users can be very, very helpful. And then also trying to make sure that as you're approaching the problem, you understand like, hey, why is this important to someone? And like, what are the pressures that are going on to them? Do they need to hit a deadline? Do they need some big success? Like understanding what their personal definition of success is going to lead a long way. Because
are you talking about the product manager in this case?
Very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Because if they just want to show that they can get something out the door quickly, that's very different from they're going to have to deal with the ramifications of the launch a month afterwards and having to go back and fix it and justify to their leadership why they need more time to do this. So always understanding what pressures your team members are under, especially those product managers, and how much it's going to cost the business, and like basically understanding where your recommendations fit in to the broader picture of what it means to ship product.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly why I'm thinking more about how agile works and how experienced teams work, and if there's something that we can learn as experienced people and product people and how agile worked, because I think that, how you're talking about, in a lot of cases, and, this is certainly not every case by far, but I think it happens enough for us to care about it and talk about it. Whereas you as a researcher, you as a UX person on a product team is kind of at the mercy of the product manager, who's the one who's setting the rules and who's owning the roadmap and this kind of thing. And if you have a disagreement with them, then they're probably going to win out just because they're the ones who are expected to deliver on this specific project. So that could set up unnecessary tensions, I think, and put people under pressures that they may not need to have. And just from a structural point of view, to create a collaborative environment that, to create an environment that's not as collaborative as it could be if set up in a different way. I think your point about quality is one I share, and I've found that when you make something, it's almost, I sometimes don't like using insights, only because an insight does seem to be something that is like anyone can have an insight. Like you can sit and think about something on your armchair and have an insight, and it may not be true. But I sometimes like to think about what we do, especially evaluative, because it can be more quantitative, as facts. And if you present a fact to a team, and you brought up another great point about how to prioritize, and you need to prioritize for them and make the team really care about a specific usability issue if you find one. And if you present it as fact, and now we're talking about rigor, it becomes very difficult for them to, question it. And that's a motivating factor. I think that's very motivating for a team, because you're taking yourself as the researcher out of the picture.
Yeah. And let's talk for a moment, because I know a lot of product managers and engineers can be very data driven. Qualitative data is equally as valid as quantitative data. But I think something that a lot of people don't quite understand from that perspective, or at least not as frequently, is that with quantitative data, the numbers are determined more by power analysis, whereas with qualitative data, what we're looking for is saturation. And it's really funny, because sometimes you'll have someone who's maybe newer and say, oh, well, we need to have enough numbers here, so we need to have 30 people as part of the usability study. And you're like, no, we really don't. They're like, but I really want the numbers. And sometimes you can roll them back and say, well, why don't you come and show up to all the studies? And I find that if someone shows up to even one study, they think that is like the end all be all. And then you have to say, hold up, let's wait for some patterns. But they'll start to feel themselves. Maybe you've hit 6, 7 participants. There's saturation. So you're starting to hear the same things over and over again. So one of the things that I like to have people do is to make sure to invite their stakeholders and even plan session times and have their stakeholders agree to show up for them. And that can really help people understand and feel what saturation means, so that they can understand that your recommendations are coming from a place of rigor, that you're really meaning something important, and that your findings, your recommendations are going to make a meaningfully better product.
Yeah. So, you talk about, you're bringing up mixed methods here, and I think your point about saturation is great. And it's something when you experience it firsthand, and you keep on, like every time you do a more qualitative type usability, it almost like clockwork, by 5 or 6 or 7, you're starting to get identical things being said, and nothing really new. So I think that's an important concept for product teams to understand. I think there are research rigor, when speaking about research, experimental design concepts, I think that it would behoove a lot of, certainly designers. It's actually a little bit disappointing that a lot of designers don't know more about experimental design concepts and even statistics. But I would even say that product people should at least be aware of them and knowledgeable to some degree. They don't need to get into the weeds like a researcher might have to, but this is an important, like if you're working with somebody and you're consuming a document or knowledge that someone has presented and has produced, let's say, you really should have a general concept of understanding. And I think it's also on us as researchers too, to make the findings consumable and not make it boring or kind of getting to the heart of what people need to know. And then if they want to continue to dive into it, maybe have maybe a lightweight version, then more of a heavy version, and have both kind of put in the research depot. That's actually a good maybe segue before we get to your work and your articles, but around documenting research. And because, if you have a team that's large, even if it's not large, but especially if it's large, and you've gotten buy-in and you're dropping researchers and they're doing their research thing and they're producing knowledge, that can kind of get overwhelming very quickly in terms of where it all goes and how to synthesize it and how to bring it all together. So how do you think about the best ways for the knowledge to get developed first and foremost? I mean, we talked already around, embedded models and working with cross-functional teams and getting the research actually, done and hopefully taken forward in the way that the researcher feels that it should be taken forward, but then documenting it and storing it and searching for it and this kind of thing. How do you see that these types of things go wrong typically? And what kind of methods and models do you find to be useful in your experience?
I am perhaps unexpectedly passionate about this topic. So at Indeed, we have over 100 UX researchers at the company. It's a phenomenal team, really high quality work. I love it for a number of reasons, because also we have so many wonderful colleagues that we can learn from, so that we can improve our own work. But first and foremost, I want to talk about the quality of an individual piece of research and making sure that it's there before getting to the full documentation. So as with any study, when we're following the scientific method, what first and foremost is really important to do is to outline why you're doing the study and the research questions that you have, and making sure to align with your team for whom this research is for, and basically yourself. So what do we need to learn in order for this to be successful? Also making sure that you are defining the appropriate participant criteria, what it means to be included in this study, and the like. Then, of course, there's executing it, doing quality analysis on it, and then providing those recommendations. I always say that any piece of research that is done should be documented. In industry, this typically means in either a deck or some sort of written document. And part of that is, again, outlining what you did in the study, but a big part of it is saying, here are the major insights, and here's the evidence that supports it, and then here's what we should do based on that. And to your point, Chris, we want to make it compelling. We don't want to make it a slog to get through. We don't want people to have insights buried that they're passing through. Try and make sure that it is as clear as possible to your relevant team members what exactly you learned and what to do based on that. So I think that's really the foundation of any study. The second thing is, how do we make sure that this gets out or it's stored in a similar place? I think that any company should have a system of where they document and put research so that other people can access it, because we don't want to end up reinventing the wheel over and over and over again, whether that's a new researcher on the same team trying to do something similar to what someone did, 2 or 3 years ago, or a team on a totally different side of the company that just realizes that there is no research on the topic. Well, maybe there is, it just wasn't published in a shared format. So I generally always recommend that there is a good place for people to put their research and to make it searchable, so that we can learn from each other and not recreate research that has already been done, especially not for some of those enduring evergreen insights.
Yeah. So this is maybe a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I've found, again, I try to take the human-centered design model and apply it inward and kind of turn the lens around on our own practice to try to enhance it always, which is something I find sometimes other people bristle at times, but I think maybe it's a personality thing, but anyway, I've found that there could be a lot of pain that occurs in terms of, because give example for Indeed, if you have 100 researchers, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know, a good amount of those are ICs who are pushing out these decks pretty frequently. So I mean, that is a lot of knowledge that's being created, and to kind of sift through that seems to be a challenge to know how to best design for easy access and easy consumption. So one of the things that I've ran into time and time again, and I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but when you join a team and maybe it's been open for a year or 2 years longer, and there's been a ton of research done before, maybe these researchers have left the company, so you can't even go and sync up with them to get like a knowledge share. But going through, and this is why I think documenting it and making sure that it's consumable is so important, but trying to go through these decks and understand what was known and what was learned based on them and what direction was taken becomes very taxing. So, one of the things I've felt like we should kind of try to standardize, or like at least think more about in terms of our best practices, is attaching a Word doc. It doesn't even have to be a long, paper that you would find in an academic journal. It doesn't have to get to that level of rigor, but at least, a page or so that kind of in words explains the story, the narrative of why it was done, the methods that we used, and having a small discussion section where it's like what occurred, in terms of what we found that we expected, what we found that we were not expecting, how the stakeholders took it, and then what was ultimately done. And then before this research is like, we can consider it to be over, that document needs to be produced to be attached to the deck, so that for future researchers or designers or whoever, they'll be able to get a sense of, okay, this was what happened, and now I know, and I can piece together the history and the narrative of this project a little bit better. I don't know. Is that something that you've thought at all about?
I mean, I'm very supportive of that. Typically in our decks, that always includes like the context of why the work was done, what the purpose was. But I really like the additional idea of like what came of this, as a nice way to tie it all off. Part of that is making sure to come back and do it, because sometimes research takes a while to filter through to something that becomes shipped product or not. Just because a lot of the times the recommendations have to then move into designing content, then move into engineering, et cetera, before they actively, go out the door. So part of that would just be being able to keep tabs and follow up on your research.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, when is it officially closed? It's hard. It's hard to draw the line there sometimes, because it keeps on getting passed around and different people are interpreting it and making decisions based on it. So and sometimes it can be tough to really know that this is now the door's shut. But do you have any best practices, any ways of knowing when, because it's something that we hear a lot also from stakeholders who are looking for research. I've in the past given them decks from a few years back, and they want new data because they find it to be out of date. And when asked, kind of when you ask them, well, what how do you know that it's out of date, and is there an easy way to kind of know when the shelf life of a individual piece of research has expired?
Oh, great question. So there's some things that are going to naturally have a shorter shelf life. So I know that we've been talking a lot about usability studies in this conversation, but if we do a usability study and then we change the product based on that, obviously, it's done its job, and it's
not really useful anymore.
It's no longer well. I mean, no, it delivered exactly on its purpose.
Yes. It did what it had to do, and it's probably not. No one really is going to be gaining too much value from it anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really different from some of the more enduring and foundational insights. So I'd say if you're looking at the research, is it on something is it on a product? That may in and of itself give it a shelf life if the product has evolved. But there's some more fundamental things about, looking at your populations. And so sometimes, I'm on the employer side of things. Typically, we will be studying recruiters. There's a lot of things that are always constant. Yes, we'll see labor market shifts, but a lot of times those things don't get out of date, whether they're done 10 years ago or today or in another 5 or 10 years. So there's some things that generally remain fairly steady, especially when you're focusing on the people. Maybe for tools they're using, those are going to be a little bit more out of date. But again, I think it's whether you're focusing on the people or what they're using as a gauge of whether something might have a shelf life or not.
Definitely great tips to keep in mind when having those discussions. So, okay, well, we definitely, I think, got into some great digressions there around rigor and around different models of UX and maturity. Before, I think the last question, I do want to get your take around mixed methods and qualitative and quantitative before we get to your data. But one of the things I've noticed, and I would like to see if you align with this or not, but quantitative methodologies. Well, so first off, we have, it seems now, different types of research titles. So I think if you go back, and maybe some of your data can also inform and enlighten the points that I'm making here. But if you go back maybe 10, 15 years, the title of UX researcher was either non-existent or very rare. But if you look at it now, there also seems to be branching, so that you have job listings that are qualitative UX researcher, quantitative UX researcher, right? So they're actually even making the division there. Then I've seen job titles that have mixed methods researcher. So, and it does, I at least feel like if you want to continue in your career, it's probably best to get acumen and level up on both, because they're both very useful in terms of depending on where you are in the design process. And if you want to continue to be a leader or a people manager, I feel like having an understanding of both is probably important. It does seem, though, that originally, maybe it's changing now, but 5 years ago or so, because my background is in human factors, which takes quite a quantitative approach, and then after a few years of that, I moved into the UX space, and this was 5 or 6 years ago. It did seem like there was a emphasis on qualitative, where when people would talk about user research, they actually just meant qualitative data, which to me seems like now at least is maybe not a good way of going at it, not a good way of summarizing what it is UX researchers do. But on top of that, I mean, partly why I say that is because I've found that when you're doing generative research, it's pretty hard to get an understanding of those needs and people's goals and intentions and the reason why they do things based on survey data or analytics and this kind of thing. You really need to go deeper and get a better understanding through interviews or observations in the field. And then, though, when you are doing things that are more downstream or evaluative, it becomes much easier to structure a study in almost in an algorithmic way. So, for example, a unmoderated usability test, right, where you kind of set it up like it is a survey to some degree, even though you're letting people do tasks, but you're collecting data and you're analyzing the data, and you're looking for patterns and results, right, where you're not really probing too much or trying to understand why. You're just trying to see what's happening in a very precise way. So to me, it seems like both are useful, and you kind of need both. Would you support the specialization of user research, or do you feel like being a mixed methods person is probably the way to look at it?
I'm a very big proponent of specialization, and I know we're going to talk about this with the articles as well, because I think that, user experience used to be primarily design, and part of that was doing research. And I think we've specialized already into having some distinct functions. But within UX research itself, yes, we do see quantitative people who primarily conduct quantitative research, whether that is through some higher level analytics, through some quantitative and more complex survey methods, things of that nature, versus qualitative, where we deal with that, very rich and smaller n qual data. And some people can do both. So I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. I think, being mixed methods myself, I always want to apply the appropriate method to the question, and one that is going to make sure that we're going to get the results that are going to be the most useful in terms of what we're trying to do with the product afterwards. But in terms of that specialization, I think it really just comes down to, we're going to need a lot of different people in a lot of different roles, and it will simply come down to supply and demand. When someone is in a dedicated qualitative role, it's good because we can always make sure that their time is dedicated to that. When someone is a quantitative role, we know that we can rely on that skill set. When someone is mixed methods, we have a little bit more wiggle room to adjust to business needs. So that can be a really good thing, to have flexibility on the team. But otherwise, I think that, a lot of people just tend to have one that they prefer, and that's totally okay. And I support that. It's just trying to make sure that we are ultimately meeting the needs of the business. And sometimes that is through quant, and sometimes that is through qual, and sometimes it's a mix of the two.
I mean, I've almost found too that when you have the ability to mix them, and for example, you start with interviews where you can really understand the different categories of answers that people will provide, and then take those and generalize it through a higher sample, you can tell a nice story and really get to go back to influencing, right? I mean, I think that we're, at the end of the day, influencers. We want our knowledge and our insights to be directed towards something, to influence somebody, to get somebody, to motivate somebody to do something. And if you can tell that story in a compelling way And if you're using both methods, I've found that pushing them together and using what's great about each of them, and making sure that both of those shine through, then stakeholders typically believe you in the things that you're saying, which is the half the battle right there. So, okay, cool. So I want to now move on to the 2 articles that you wrote specifically around job listings. So to get into those, let's start off this way. If you can maybe explain and talk a little bit about what motivated you to first off start looking at this data. I mean, did you always know you were going to publish it? Did you just do it for fun? How did it come about?
So being at Indeed, we have an absolute treasure trove of data about the job market. And what really inspired me was that I saw and I felt a lot of people going through some pain when they are candidates for jobs. And then, of course, I too, as a hiring manager, trying to hire folks at the height of the market, it was challenging myself. Having people walk away from offers, go to other companies. It happens. It was a challenging time. So what I wanted to do was see what the data even said about the job market, because I saw a lot of takes that were based on what people were feeling. And I just wanted to see what the reality was. And so,
where did you see these takes? Was it like social media, this kind of place, or?
Yeah, on social media, people had written articles in a variety of places. And again, I'm in a unique position where we have access to that data. Of course, we have to share it in certain ways, based on our company's policies. And part of that was just looking in, like, what does it say today? What does it say about UX roles? What does it say about design roles versus research roles versus product versus software roles? Seeing what the data said really started telling a story unto itself. And that was a story that I thought that the greater UX community would want to know. And so that's what drove me to work with our company to publish this for a wider audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating, both articles, because like you said, it was a very dynamic time. And I think UX in general is a very dynamic field. So things are constantly changing, and you have a lot of opinions. You have a lot of people sounding off on all types of ways and on all types of platforms. And it's sometimes difficult. And this might be a theme that at least I've pulling out of both of the articles in terms of, misinformation and thinking more about, we've already mentioned maturity and UX maturity and UX research maturity in terms of understanding what's real and what's not real on social media and in blog posts and different platforms. One of the things that I found refreshing about your articles and data was that it was backed up by facts, and it was very interesting to see the narrative based on your findings maybe run counter to some of these what I would like to call Chicken Little UX people who are talking about how the sky is falling over the last year or so. But before we get into what I mean by that, I want to first get your take of how the insights that came out of this data analysis that you chose to highlight. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the first article that I published, which is called UX Job Listings Plunged in 2023. And so in this particular article, what I explored is the evolution of UX job postings from Q1 of 2021 all the way through the halfway point of 2023. And so the story there is that job listings absolutely soared through the nadir, which was Q1 of 2022. They started pulling back a little bit in that second half of 2022, and then started really falling going into 2023. And this is a lot of what people have been saying. Yes, it's a lot harder to get a job. We also know that there were a lot of layoffs, which pushed a number of practitioners into the job market themselves. But I also wanted to point out in this article that our sister disciplines in tech, so product management and software engineering, follow almost exactly that same curve. So that same rise, that same fall. There's a little bit of differences in between them, but essentially everyone is feeling this same type of pain. So it is not unique to UX. It is part and parcel of being in tech.
Yeah. And I think that's the key point, at least that I've taken from this first article, whereas you hear a lot of UX leaders talking about the demise of UX, how UX has to get reorganized or it has to change, and people are not valuing it like they used to be valuing it. But what I found to be quite interesting, and I think ingenious, that you made sure that you included software and software development and product. And it does follow the same signature, which is interesting, and I think is it takes off the stigma, I think, a little bit from UX and how and what has happened in the past 18 months or so.
Yeah. And I guess I would say if anyone is saying UX is dying, well, based on my data, that's akin to saying that software engineering is dying. And I don't think anyone believes that.
Exactly. Yeah. Which I think is something that UXers out there really should know. I think it's extremely important.
Thank you. The second article that I wrote is called UX Research Job Postings Show the Discipline is Here to Stay. And so that original article, I had really just looked at a 2.5 year long period, but I heard a lot of outcries from the community that they wanted to know how this compared earlier data that we had. It's like, yes, we all know the pandemic was a weird time. And how does this all fit into the bigger picture? And so there's a couple main takeaways from this article. The first was I was looking at UX research and UX design. And over a period of 10 years, we see that UX research is taking up a growing share of job postings among the UX function. So if we just look at UX research and UX design, research took up a little under 10% of these positions a decade ago in 2013. And it has just been a consistent year-over-year rise in research as a proportion of our UX job listings every single year. However, it reached its peak in 2022 at a little over 35%. In 2023, or the first half of 2023, we saw that drop a little bit down to about almost exactly a third, so 33.2%. So importantly here, we just understand that the proportion of UX research continues to grow among UX roles.
Okay, so great. So I'd like to, well, actually, let me first pause and make sure that you're done with explaining the second article, because I do want to go back to the first one and just start there.
Sure. So there's one more point in the second article, and that is, again, pulling back and saying, hey, if we look at this over time, how are UX disciplines faring compared to some of our sister disciplines? Mm-hmm. So I do start back in Q1 of 2018. And then I go quarter over quarter all the way to that second quarter of 2023. And what we see here is that UX research still has made the largest proportional inroads. And so Q2 of 2023 was at 153% of the job listings that we were seeing in Q1 of 2018. So it's really important that, yes, we saw a pullback at the beginning of the pandemic. Things rose throughout 2020. They were already superseding 2020 levels, or like the beginning of 2020. They were already superseding the end of 2019 and early 2020 by 2021. And then we have this meteoric rise and then a fall. But we're still ahead of really where we were just a couple years ago.
Yeah. Okay, Kathryn. So starting with your first, with the first article, like I was saying, the narrative, and I want to, we have the data, we can see the signature and the trends, but of course, our research minds want to jump to the why and the reasons of why we see a ballooning and then kind of a contraction, towards the last year or so. So, I mean, the simple and a kind of obvious, I think, cause or reason as to why we saw a pretty, I wouldn't say flat line, but definitely, minimal growth in terms of percentage differences. And then we saw this skyrocket right around 2021. Now, it seems like the obvious answer is that the pandemic opened up companies, opened up these roles. And my guess is because people thought that they didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. We were already moving towards like a more digitized ways of communicating with one another, ways of living with one another. And I think that maybe businesses would expect that trend to only increase because of what happened from a pandemic spreading point of view. So is that the most plausible explanation as to what caused this rise in all tech jobs, not just UX research?
I am not an expert in this, but I generally agree. I think a lot of companies did see the opportunity to pivot into new spaces that they maybe hadn't invested as much in before, but perhaps they also wanted to continue to employ people on teams that were, part of their business that were generating the most money. So I think it's entirely plausible that these companies were just deciding to invest in new areas. So I think that is certainly one reason that hiring was so hot in 2021 and early 2022.
Yeah, and then obviously the decline might align with, from a timeline point of view, when we got vaccinated and when cases started dropping, and it does seem to follow a little bit the trajectory of the pandemic. And when it's at its worst, it seems like the jobs were more plentiful. And then as the pandemic has subsided, there does tend to be a decline with the tech postings. And again, it seems correlated, but I don't know if it's causing it, but it definitely seems to be like the big political, socioeconomic factor that's happening.
Yeah, I would say that I have a slightly different take on it. To me, when we look at the data, it's a little bit offset actually from the pandemic. And so what I look at here is people, again, to my earlier point, investing in new products and services and making sure that, as we shift our ways of living, that people can capture that market share. But I don't think that every innovation and every business idea panned out. So I think that's a big part of it. And as the companies were starting to see where their investments were paying off the most, that was fantastic, but a lot of them don't. And so to me, that's where maybe we see some ideas of like layoffs and consolidations, and then not having that blank check so much in order to hire. I think we have definitely seen a lot of companies have to come back when they're reporting on earnings every quarter. And I think we know that some companies simply overhired. But that doesn't mean that demand for some of these roles has vanished. I think there is still demand across the software industry to hire folks. It's just less than before.
It's less than before, but the other great point I think that this data shows too is that it is also rising. So even though there was a fall, if you compare it to a few years ago, it's still more jobs than before.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and it was an interesting time. I don't know if you experienced this, but I know I certainly did. Was that it was very weird because right when your data was showing that there was that ballooning in jobs and research in particular got quite hot. I think I was getting messages from recruiters probably every other day about jobs. And that was happening for close to a year maybe. But currently, I don't think I've heard from a recruiter, via LinkedIn in over 2 or 3 months. So it was very funny to watch that or experience that wave happen in real time.
And a lot of us experience the same things. I will say the same thing. Yeah. Sometimes it was every day, during that hot period. And it was hard too, because I was also trying to hire during that period. And, candidates are in and they get, by the time that you get back to them that you want to have an interview, they've already been snapped up or something like that. So, it was a challenging time to hire. It was a great potential time to get a new job. And now the tables have turned a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to the second one. That's your second article there that, and really start, I think, digging into the user research job posting data and what this means, I think, in terms of maturity, in terms of a lot of the topics we've already covered, in terms of the growth, in terms of where the field is going, these kinds of things. So do you have good intuitions around why? So let's first start with that ballooning signature. Why user research in particular was outpacing the other three job titles that you chose to focus on?
Yeah. And I want to be clear that outside of the ballooning moment, research has really peeled away from some of these other disciplines and has continued to hire at a higher rate than these other disciplines. But yeah, it's a really great point, Chris. So there's a couple things that I believe are driving some of the demand here. So the first is specialization. So historically, research could have been done by a number of different people, and it still continues to be done this day by a variety. However, maybe earlier on in the tech industry, that might have been done by product managers or designers or hired through outside agencies, for instance. When we're looking at this, when you have a dedicated researcher, it's nice because you can actually dedicate their time to it. So one is if you're, say, a designer and you're trying to produce things in Figma or whatever tool of choice, then you're having to make choices about whether you're dedicating things towards the craft of producing things versus learning. And that's the same thing with product. It starts to split your attention. And so if you're doing the research, there's the opportunity cost of doing something else instead. And sometimes people and businesses can say, we just really need to get the designs out right now, or we really need to do planning right now, or we really need to do X. So having someone dedicated can really make space to make sure that there is time for this at an organization. Also, someone can come in with a different or more specialized skill set. So I know a lot of folks learn about usability testing when they first encounter the idea of user research, but there's a lot more methods than that. You know, we have interviews, we have contextual inquiries, we have diary studies, we have all sorts of different survey methods, we have card sorts, we have tree tests, et cetera, et cetera. And so one thing there is a researcher can come in with a much bigger toolbox for research and be able to pick sometimes better tools in order to answer questions. So I think specialization is the first major driver around this. And I think that's a really important one.
Was there anything that you can kind of say, or would you say that there's also a reason around the value that research is providing to businesses that is causing that demand? And this is maybe speaks to one of your graphs that show a percentage of research jobs to design, and how that has been growing consistently over a period of 10 years, except for maybe that last year at the end there in 2023. But
yeah, I mean, I think there's clearly demand for insights. I also know that a lot of companies have become a lot more sophisticated with how they treat data over not just the years, but the decades. You know, they are more targeted and understand which products are getting the most usage. They know where their revenue is coming from, et cetera. And part of increased data sophistication is, maybe you started with the quant, but you're realizing that you really need to know what is getting people to your products and how to keep them there, how to stay. I mean, these are all aspects of being competitive in the market. And so I think research really helps deliver on some of those insights. And like I was saying before, becomes a protected activity when someone is a dedicated researcher, as opposed to having quite a number of different things that they're trying to do and in a more generalist fashion. So I think.
So what does this analysis mean for UX? I mean, what would you like designers and researchers to kind of take away from what your analysis has shown?
What I'm hoping that aspiring researchers take away from this is that, yes, there are more design roles, but that there are positions out there for people who wanted to do dedicated research. When I was looking for my first job 10 years ago, it definitely felt like there were almost none in the research side, so that there are positions out there. But I would also say that we're starting to get more and more specialized. So while there will always be positions for generalists, I think there's value in trying to find where you shine in particular, and really figuring out how to dive into that and become an expert in that space. I think it's always important to know how to work with your cross-disciplinary partners, but that probably the bulk of roles will end up being more specialized. For example, in research and design and content, or even within research, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. We have research operations now too, to figuring out where your passion is.
I know you also, published, which, I'll make sure to include, again, with the other two articles that we just discussed, around an article where you're discussing the maturity history, or the way that research within the company that you're at now, Indeed, grew, how it started, and how it's operating, how, the status quo. And it does, from after reading it, seem like a great success story where it went from a very small function within a very large organization and grew and kind of scaled quickly. So maybe you want to, summarize that for the audience first.
Absolutely. So that particular article, I had interviewed Dave Yates, who was, I believe, the second researcher hired at Indeed, second or third, who is currently a senior director of UX research at the company, and really wanted to see what his perspective was and some of the very early UXers on how UX established itself at Indeed and how it grew over time. And I think there's a couple really important points that we discussed in that particular interview. So the first was the importance of establishing credibility. The next was showing effectiveness of UX research to drive outcomes and basically make things better for the business through making them better for our users. And then also how to go about making business cases for UX research, whether that is hiring more researchers because you need to scale the team, whether that is providing better tooling that is going to enhance the quality of what people put out, et cetera. So the big point was, how do you grow a team that's very small into something that is a large and generally well-oiled machine?
And it seems like you have done that goal has been accomplished. I'm sure there are always, hiccups and pain points that can need to be smoothed, like anywhere. But it is quite an impressive story in terms of how quickly the team scaled up and the vision and how that was brought to fruition. So one of the things I liked about the article too was you were talking about making the business cases for specific details in terms of what it is that researchers need. And one of those was space. So instead of having to go through the normal Outlook's booking system or whatever system that you use to actually book physical space, this is probably pre-pandemic when this was going on. But now that it's over, I think hopefully we can get more in-person research off the ground. Hopefully that hasn't gone away. But really dedicating space and rooms and real estate to having researchers being able to do their research thing, I think is really important. So that was cool to learn about.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was really cool. When I started at Indeed, I think our lab had gone in not a month before. So it was a brand new lab. It was really fantastic to be able to do research in. And, we have labs in Austin where their headquarters is, in Seattle, in San Francisco, and I think in Tokyo as well. So the fact that we had that dedicated space, it was fantastic, not just for the researchers and the participants, but also because we could have our colleagues come in and watch the sessions live. And that is just such a great way to get involvement, stakeholder involvement, and also get that action from the team. So having that space was a really big win that I credit to some of the earliest Indeedian UXers.
Let's maybe finish off on a nice another discussion around UX research maturity and how to create a culture. I mean, we already talked a little bit about how it's structured within organizations. So, it could be decentralized or centralized. I mean, I think that as we want to mature out the practice, it does seem like decentralization is what the goal should be. What other aspects or key key themes do you think about when you think about UX maturity? I mean, is it as simple as just bringing in the right people and then, a lot of the strategy and a lot of the changing the mindset will kind of happen naturally? Or do you feel like you need to have a strategy around changing hearts and minds of people who are non-researchers as well? And if so, what kind of strategy does that look like?
So many things here. And I will start to say that having an embedded model might be a signal of maturity, but it does not make maturity. So a lot of these things are important signals of a more mature organization as opposed to something that might be less mature. Certainly always having that mindset, but I would say in terms of organizational UX maturity, making sure that the business investments are in place so that people who are doing that IC work are able to do high quality work. I would say often it also comes from the top. How do we make sure that we have, VPs of UX? How do we make sure that we are figuring out how to measure our user experience in a way that the business can track and that we're meaningfully making progress on? I think those are some of the things that are going to help with that. And then finally, just making sure that individual people are supported. I think earlier in this conversation, I had mentioned there's a distinction about an individual's own career path and the maturity of the UX organization. Every organization needs to be able to take in people who are newer and grow their careers. And so having those ladders in place, those expectations, having people grow, do great work, I think that's all part of it. But ultimately, the greatest signal of maturity to me is that people are putting in effort that does not go wasted. So a really mature organization is one that understands the value and uses things appropriately. So if we're throwing away work because we didn't need it or it didn't come at the right time, we're not using our resources, the people, everything to the best of their ability. So I think it's always about the growing and the best ability for the bang for your buck, making sure that we're getting out what we put in, getting more out than what we put in, are really the true signals. And if we're feeling like something isn't working, like taking that signal to heart and then saying, what can we do about it to make it better? Because it doesn't have to be a dead end. Like, how do we make things better? I ask myself this regularly. I ask this of my leaders. I ask this of my team. If we're stuck, how do we get unstuck? And how do we move forward to make this more meaningful?
Yeah, I think a saying that I sometimes use with, senior leaders or with people who I'm on cross-functional teams with, and I'm collaborating is, I don't want research to ever just happen in a vacuum and then when it gets produced, it just disappears into the ether and nobody really cares, right? Because there's a question around quality, but if you really know how to produce quality work and then it doesn't have impact, then it becomes very frustrating for people, I think. And then that's when I think you can get more churn that way. You can get people who can, become demoralized and, the morale gets low if the work isn't really being taken forward. So I'm torn because I feel like if you really want to make impact, you need to be in close quarters with the people who are, consuming that research, so you can really tailor the product, the research deck, to them, so that not only is it satisfying their needs, but it's also consumable, so that they can know what to do with it, and it's not confusing. But there's also this other part of me where that is putting research into a researcher into a box a little bit, and there are a lot of different studies and work and creative ideas that can get taken forward, not attaching it to a specific team and just allowing more blue sky and skunkwork type research to happen that might allow for the company to be taken into a direction that is unexpected.
Absolutely. And then I had not encountered the term skunk work before. Can you tell me what that means?
So, yeah, the long story short, it's more of this kind of work, this kind of innovation that gets done outside of a typical business team. So, usually very high tech companies will create innovation labs, create groups and teams that are completely separate from the bigger entity, and just let them play and just let them kind of do whatever they want. And, there's different philosophies on this. I think that it can produce it's possible that it could just be a waste, but it also is where some of the most novel type of products and services and experiences can come about, because you're allowing people to kind of just follow their creativity or curiosity.
Got it. Internal innovation labs. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been on a few of these teams before, and, I think having a model because I think for research, again, we've had this, we've already brought up this point where it's a big part of what we can do. It's not what we always do, but a big part of I think the value that we can add. And this is another maybe good topic to kind of end on, which is, the return on investment of research, and, how to make the business case. But I think one of a business case that can be made is via trying to think about things from a different point of view, and not just trying to chase your competitors, but to really start from a deep understanding of your product, your customers, how they're interacting with what you're providing, and then from that understanding and kind of getting a sound understanding of this complexity of interaction, you can then seek to bring about new ways that interaction is designed. And the best way for you to do that, I think, is to start with a understanding of your customers, and that will then lead to better designs, because you can really have a sense of what it is that you want to change and why. So, but to me, that's a very high mature organization that is really basing their innovation strategy and roadmaps on user insights, which I have yet to really find a place that does that to a degree where I feel like to a degree that, well, really to any degree. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and just to build on that with maybe a less lofty take, like, why do businesses hire people? They're hiring them so that they're putting in the cost of having the employee to either deepening client spend or expanding the number of clients they serve and or reducing that churn. And so where I see UX is doing this is making sure we're focusing on those user needs, wants, and problems and solving well for that, so that the people who might be interested in, a company's services are getting the value out that they put in and potentially are sticking with you more so than they're sticking with some of the other companies that they do business with. And so the more we can deepen spend, broaden our client base, and reduce that churn, that's where almost every function works within in a business, and UX can really focus on the users to make that a reality and basically become a very competitive business in the market.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of talk in the UX world right now around return on investment, and it's sometimes difficult to make the argument from like a numbers point of view, or from a very deeply quantitative point of view. But I think that, just logically, if you look at the competitive landscape and why businesses exist and how they succeed and how they fail, it does appear to me that the better, you're upping your chances for your business to succeed if you're smarter, if you have better intelligence. I mean, this is any organization. It doesn't even have to be business. It could be a military. It can be all types of different organizations that are in a kind of competitive landscape. If you're smarter than your competitor and you have you have insights that they don't have, then you're able to outcompete them, or at least there's a higher chance, all things being equal, that you'll be able to outcompete them. And that is right where research comes in. So to me, that's where we want to really focus the return on investment. We want to focus on it can differentiate your whole business. And that's partly what motivates people, as you were saying before, to stick with the company and to or to broaden the amount of customers that you have and retain people. It all starts and ends with being more intelligent than your competitors about what it is your customers are doing, what they're saying, what they want, and what their goals are, and understanding them. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this is why user research, I feel like, is probably, I sometimes look at it as, the name of the podcast is the universal lens, is that you can apply that to basically any industry, I think.
I completely agree. Yeah. And customer acquisition is expensive. And if you have a leaky bucket because your products aren't delivering what people thought they were going to be delivering, then you don't have a business for very long. And so I completely agree. User research is fantastic in that intelligence aspect. And, design can really be helpful in that execution. How do we make sure we're delivering on the promises and what we learned about?
Exactly. Yeah. Design is really where, I think that's partly why I like to focus or I gravitate towards the research, because you really are just trying to, in a sense, mirror what's going on and just report as, clearly as you can. Like, this is what we know. This is this is what we understand. So, it's very empirical. Whereas when you get into the realm of, okay, now we have this problem, how do we solve for it? That's very difficult, and that there's not one right or wrong way to do it, right? And that's where maybe some of the fun comes in, I guess. But I think that I would like to leave that to my designer colleagues who are probably more suited to come up with those elegant and beautiful solutions than me. So.
I feel the same.